Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Roger, you're at Limits Edge Machine Works, and today we're going to do a video covering the teardown of a manual transmission. It's a Honda A2 or Acura CG transmission. It would have came out of something like a 1985 to 1989 Acura Integra. This transmission was deemed irreparable by another shop, and they left it as it was disassembled. So what we call that is a basket case. It means it was already partially taken apart, at least, when it showed up here. We're going to dig into it and see if there's anything that we could do to save it. But enough of this intro, let's get into the disassembly. So leading into this video here, I want to just take it real slow going in. I'm looking at every piece. That's the throwout bearing. That's the shift fork for overdrive. And on this transmission, overdrive is the common failure. That's fifth gear. It hangs out there past the main case and just has a little tin cover. And apparently just can't get enough oil flow, or if it gets low at all on oil, they just burn fifth gear right out of them. I think every one of these CG transmissions I've ever opened up has had a burned up fifth gear, even the ones that were driving around fine. You look at the gear and you're like, how? How are you not howling like a banshee? One important part, especially if you are doing a basket case, is to knurl your parts. That's a term I picked up, actually. I had never heard it before until my cousin Justin, who was studying an apprenticeship to be an electrician, he told me about the term knurling. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, when you lay out all your pieces, you know, as you take it apart or before you go back together, to make sure that you have all of your pieces. And so that you can spot, let's say you've got 13 bolts that are the same length and one that's a little different, or one that's got a shoulder on it for, you know, to guide the next piece onto it. Well, you need to identify that bolt and make sure it gets into the right spot. On the same token, as you're tearing one of these down, if you didn't tear it apart, make sure you pay attention to the bolt holes. I see somebody's had this cover off and siliconed it back on once. Well, that's a really common place for you to get silicone down in the bottom of the bolt hole. And then once or twice of doing that, even once of doing that, and the bolt that goes in there and tightens up on that silicone isn't actually squeezing the gasket, it'll just blow the case out and shoot a little piece of you know, aluminum from the back of that cast boss into your transmission. That's no good. And again, this is just more laying it out, trying to make sure that I've got an eye on everything. You can see here on the synchronizer, I'm scratching it with my thumbnail. You can tell how worn out one is typically by dragging a nail across it. Now you need to check them against the gear they're going to mate with as well to make sure that they'll do their job properly. But on teardown, a good scratch of the fingernail across a lot of your thrust surfaces, bearing surfaces, and synchros will tell you what it is that you're seeing. And that's what it is. When you're tearing a unit apart, yeah, you can listen to the customer's complaint, and you can listen to maybe what somebody else has to say about it. But what the bottom line is that the transmission is going to tell you what happened to it. People lie, people misinterpret things. It's a, well, and this is secondhand information on this one all as well. But it's like, you know, Joe Blow said that he was driving around in fifth gear, went out. So he's driving it around up to fourth and just keeping it first through fourth, and then he got mad racing somebody, or, you know, whatever the case was, and slammed it into the first gear instead of second. He missed a downshift and locked her up, sliding to a halt, and after that, you know, it wouldn't work anymore. Well, that's kind of vague. What the transmission tells me from teardown is that it ran out of oil. It ran really low on oil and burned the teeth off of fifth gear and locked itself into fourth gear and started to try to weld itself into gear. And in fact, you'll see it later, the transmission did weld itself into fourth gear. Now this, I want to show you guys this here, this snap ring. You have to expand it into the case, and then you hammer the bearing race down out of it. And it's just a little different. You don't see that all the time. Typically, you're not going to leave the snap ring behind. But as you can see here, a little tappy, the bearing falls right out. Same thing on the big one, it was just in there a little tighter. So it takes several wraps of the hammer. Real important, when you guys are working on anything, anywhere, keep your safety glasses on. Keep all your safety gear on, always. And when you're working on hardened things like bearings, shafts, gears, hammerheads, punches, double down on that. Like, make sure everybody's got their safety glasses on. The little chips that are flying off of there all the time, whether you see them or not. In fact, doing this job, I chipped a bearing race and 2 gear teeth. And any one of those pieces could end up in an eyeball, definitely could end up in your hands. Looks like it's going good. I just wanted to make sure nothing was, you don't want to hammer the snap ring into the groove and bind anything up. It can break the case there. So, it went out though. There it goes. Got the snap ring out of that groove. And got the snap ring out of that groove. That little one gave me a little trouble. That holds the seal into the differential output for one side. There's the seal. That piece is as stripped down as it needs to be. Moving on to the next one. I want you to pay attention to the amount of tools I have out as well. This is typically my go-to for tearing a transmission down. If you got a set of sockets, basic hand tools, an impact wrench, set of punches, even that bolt there is my go-to punch. Snap ring pliers, 9/16 wrench. You can pretty much tear down about any transmission you want to. That one had the starter on it still. I'm not sure why the starter showed up with it, but I'll leave that bolt there where it goes. That's a good practice to get into, especially if it's unrelated to your repair. Just put it back where you got it. Now these are the little brackets and things that hold the shift rails in down here. These little transmissions have a really neat way of shifting. I'll try to highlight that as much as I can. And really, before you go to trying to take the shavs and the differential out of the case, you want to pick up and down on everything, make sure everything's loose. You never want to force anything. And a lot of the times, you can get half of the shift rails and forks out of it without actually having to take anything apart. See, there goes one. That's a reverse idler. That reverse gear there slides up and down. And it just goes from not engaging anything to engaging the main shaft and the counter shaft. And you have to have that idler gear in there to reverse the rotation of the shafts so that you end up with a reverse at least one backwards gear. For those hot rodders out there, you can flip your differential over and you could end up with 5 reverses and 1 forwards. There goes another shift rail. Okay, and that's a reverse switch right there. Don't beat on wrenches with your hands. For all you young guys out there working on stuff, don't do it. Use a hammer. Use a cheater wrench. Now you see the wire starting to twist up there because it's still got that bracket. That's where my 2 longer bolts go. That little bracket there goes onto the bell housing. And, or not the bell housing, sorry, the case halves flange. And it's got 2 extra long bolts there where that is held. But just to keep from twisting it up there, I'm spinning the wires as the switch comes out. A lot of the times you want to take all of the detent plungers and springs and things and switches out of one of these before you start really trying to tear it down, because shavs and things may not slide out of the hole with the switch in the hole still, or the detent, spring, and ball in the hole still. They'll definitely interlock and prevent you from moving 2 things at once, so the more that you get out of the way, the more stuff moves. And never force anything. Never hit anything too hard. Most of this stuff just slides right apart. Got a little spring-loaded plunger there. I want to make sure that's not going to fall out so I don't lose it. And then just set it off to the side. And this right here is the guy that grabs most of the shifting action and makes it happen. That is one big unit. Right now I'm taking off the retainer for the main bearing there at the front of the case. That'll let everything slide back my way here in just a second. There it is, that's the bearing retainer I just laid down. Now I'm popping the seal out from the other side's output for the diff. Just get it out of the way. You never know, get all your seals out of there. You're not going to reuse them. There might be a snap ring under there that you didn't see or something. Alright, wiggle everything, make sure it's now. So you want to make sure that all of the stuff is free to move around and wiggles a little bit in the case and nothing's binding up. Because most of the time, everything has to come out together. Supporting the weight a little bit there so that it doesn't try to just fall apart. And then give every shaft you can see a little tappy tap with a rubber mallet. Give it all a little wiggle. And you'll see each piece is moving forward just a little bit every time I wiggle it and pull on it. And then it'll just fall apart. Like that. Now we've got the individual shafts tear down. This thing's, sometimes these might have to press apart. In my experience at this age, as long as the splines are in good shape, these will be fine. You got the 3 slits there, they were on the outside, so those go up. The back side had 4. Same thing on this gear, you see 1, 2, 3. They go up. This is kind of a neat, if you didn't know it, that's actually what's carrying all of the load right there. Those little ears, if you call them, or dogs. That synchro's in good shape. This is a kind of an interesting thing. Another one if you didn't know it. See how that synchro hub has got gear teeth on it? That is where the reverse idler slides over to lock into the shaft, and it just does it by splining and gearing onto that outside of that synchro hub. Not uncommon. That's just a hub. I don't know why I'm showing you that. Another synchro ring. It's in good shape. I got all new ones coming anyways, but they're in good shape. We'll save them for spares. Bearings in good shape. It's got thrust washer there at the bottom to keep that bearing from getting into that gear. And anytime you see a gear exposed like that, where you've got another bearing that's going to ride across the back of it and it's going to go interrupted on that tooth, you're going to see a thrust washer. Right here on the input shaft side of things, we've got 1 snap ring. Take it off. And then we're going to head over to the press, and this shaft here is going to have to be pressed apart. That's the one that had the 4th gear kind of stuck. Pay attention to the safety warnings on all this stuff, folks. You want to make sure that you've got the bearing only and that the shafts aren't going to hit anything below, especially on this press. This little press doesn't have a lot of clearance. Any bigger of a transmission and then it wouldn't go through the table. I'd have to block it up different. And if you'll pay attention here in just a second, I'll show you. There was another little washer on the back side there. You want to make sure you get that in the right spot later. Easy to forget that one. Now we're going to flip that shaft over, get that 4th gear off there. I'm going to sit in there right underneath 4th gear, and I'm going to push it and the inner race that is pressed onto the shaft and the bearing race for the intermediate bearing there. So I'm really pushing 3 things off together. That aluminum chunk I've got on the top there is just to do 2 things. Keep the press off the threads in case it is pushing hard at the initial press, and it won't go, I can't push all the way through everything, so I've got to have something to push through all that stuff. And that little bit of aluminum will help me get the reach I need to go through everything. It's a little bit long-winded, but just bear with me here and we'll get through it. Should be any second it's going to turn loose. And I'm reaching down below there to catch it. You don't want to ever just let things fall out of your press, you know. You got to either have a basket underneath full of something soft to catch it, or be able to be in two places at once, have a helper with you. Be sure if you have a helper that y'all are both exactly aware of what you're doing. But there we go. I was able to catch that. Now we're going to bring it back around here on top. The next piece typically would be a little tighter than this, but I was able to wiggle this one off of there. And you can see it didn't hurt the shaft too bad there where that bearing was a little bit stuck. We'll clean the gear up. Hopefully it'll live. There goes the synchro hub. There's third gear. Bearing. That's it for that one. Now we're putting them in the lathe here. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. The little car that this transmission came out of, it may as well have a throttle switch in it. It doesn't have any soft driving done to it ever. And anytime you're hard on transmission, you can bend the shaft. Those two gears want to deflect away from each other, whatever two gears you're in, plus the final drive wants to deflect away from the ring gear and pinion. So it's real easy if you've got a lot of throttle and a quick clutch to bend the shaft. And on top of that, this transmission seized in a gear. It got so low on oil it was driving around welded in fourth. And that's a real easy way to bend one too. If you put a gear, let's say you weld one in fourth and then you try to go in first, well, it's not going to, think of a transmission as a big calculator. It's trying to do math problems. Like first gear ratio is what it's going to spit out if you put it in first gear. Well, if it's welded in fourth gear, it's going to be in fourth gear permanently. And if you put it in first gear, it's trying to do two math problems at once, and it just can't compute. That's a good way to lock one up and split the case in two. So, just from the amount of abuse that I know this thing's been through on two different fronts there, I'm going to check these shafts and make sure they're not bent. And that first one had about 1/1000th in it. I know my chuck has got 1/1000th's worth of run out in it, and I haven't touched a tailstock alignment in this lathe in decades, so I'm just going to leave it at the fact that if I got them down to 1/1000th, they're going to live. And it only took a moment. And there's other ways to check shafts for straightness too. You could just put a couple ball bearings in the press and spin them up in the press. You could put a couple V-blocks on a table and put the indicator on them. I just use the lathe because it's handy. I'm not using it under power, I'm just spinning it up by hand. But there you can see you got, gosh, 1/1000th maybe. So, both shafts are in good shape straightness wise. And here's just a shot again of everything laid out on the table. Just basic hand tools, snap ring pliers, punch, chunk of brass. There's a gear puller there. I didn't actually end up using it. I just wanted to show you guys that a gear puller that size would probably do everything that I needed to do here. I just didn't because I have a press. Well guys, that wraps up the disassembly portion of this video. Now I'm going to do another one later showing how to put it all back together after I get it cleaned up and the new parts come in. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell icon to be notified of future videos. I really appreciate the viewership, and any comments that show me how to improve this or for suggestions on future videos, please leave those below. I also will link below my Patreon account if there's anybody out there that would like to support the channel. You guys just have the best day of your lives today, and I'll see you next time.